Hello, good evening. It is the 22nd of December 2022 and no, it's 2021. You can see I've lost a bit of track of time, but I had a busy time in the last few days and I've only got around now to read a chapter. Because it is chapter 33, I thought I'll do it today on the 22nd of December 21. This story was written 15 years ago. And it's called BLISS, Afterlife, and it is about the departure and passing of Bliss Mayland, who was 95 and passed a peaceful death after her 95th birthday. And we are now coming into the chapters which are dealing with a new incarnation. Chapter 33. Alexei takes the next step. He had no real perception of the time he had spent in the world of spirit. There was nothing to measure against. Alexei had worked through his last existence and spent time resting and contemplating. He had the most enjoyable time with his soul group. It is such interesting companionship and the fusion of thoughts, all contributing with life experiences from many incarnations, was something he already knew he would miss once he was back in a physical body. He was presently in nothingness, not possible to describe with words, getting ready to reincarnate any time now. He had spent time with his elders and soul group, and they had laid basic foundations together for his next step. Suddenly, he became aware of a feeling of light awareness in a physical sense, restriction, warmth, deep sounds, rhythmic and steady. He fell asleep and felt himself back at his lake, fishing. A strange certainty overcame him, her. She was starting a new body, a female little person, still in her mother's womb. Space was getting a little tighter. She felt she could still open her arms and stretch her whole being into this body. Sounds again, faint music. She was bopping up and down, and the close drumming sound got louder and louder. She felt elated, felt good. She heard something. Again, suddenly, she was aware of sound entering her head from the outside in. Life was starting again. Already from the outside in and not any more from the inside out. Slight regret. Movement. Making her movement up and down, and then no more music. Just the sound or vibration of someone breathing. The sound of her new mother. She fell asleep to return once more to the lake and let time take its course. Chapter 34. Susan and Ben. Susan is the daughter, foster daughter of Bliss, who has passed, and Ben is her son. Susan enjoyed the peace and quiet in the big house. She had her own little place down the road, but the refuge was her big house, and she often stayed there, depending on childcare and all the little reasons which ruled her life. She had a comfortable room in the loft space. This was only ever used for guests in emergency. She considered it hers. It was late. The only time the house enjoyed some kind of silence was past midnight. It was Friday night, and Susan enjoyed the luxury of a lie-in on a Saturday. She was exempted from all chores. In fact, it has just become Saturday. She poured herself another glass of wine and settled back after putting another CD on. The house felt good at the moment. Everyone seemed to have plans. Sinead was a bit of an oddball. She had 3 of her 8 children here with her. Susan wondered what was going on with the other ones. All of them were not mixing as well as the others had managed to do. Somehow, one of the biggest challenges is to practice acceptance here. Susan tries to provide more than shelter for many of the women and children here, simply by creating a community. But this is not for everyone. Sinead was Sinead was taking refuge. That's all. She was not very communicative. She joined the dinners on and off. Her children always ate with them, but they were equally quiet. She thought of Ben, her son. He was travelling again. It came as no surprise to her that he became a foreign journalist. He always liked to be on the move. She smiled. She herself had enjoyed travelling with her ex-husband. He'd been a fairly successful musician. Still was, actually. His career had taken off again in the last few years. At the beginning, when they met, he was still a bored young guy, obsessed with his guitar, but little else interested him. Susan entered his life when he played in her friend Evelyn's garage. She fell in love with him straight away. They had all such good times. For years they had a great circle of musician friends. Steve had got a band together. They got bigger, and their venues got bigger, and slowly but surely he became popular. He and his band. Susan always travelled with him. Ben was born in London by a hair's breadth. They had been in Sweden for a couple of months, and she was so glad they had decided to cut the tour short. She had felt unwell, and Steve was very decisive, thank God. She gave birth early, and was so glad that this happened at home in England. Steve was a great support at birth. It was lovely. She had her mum and dad around when Ben was born. Bliss and Michael were still around. He had Steve's slightly brown skin. Steve's parents had come over from India many years ago. He grew up in a quite mixed culture. Although he had not lived long in India, his mother had grown up in Karachi and his father in New Delhi. It was such a coincidence that they should have met at a teachers' conference. They fell in love, got married, and then had Steve. They lived in England for some time. Lots of different cultures combined in their household. Susan had found it quite tiring sometimes. The family get-togethers were not always easy. Her own mum, Bliss, was quite good with entertaining all at her house, and she and her dad lived most of their married life in a semi-detached in South London. It was always planned for the summer, these get-together, and they all had big lunches in the garden with Steve's parents and Holly. She was still single then. Her mum really enjoyed all these different stories of their homes. She had herself liked travelling. Her marriage to Steve fell apart for many reasons, but they did have some really good times. Ben had inherited his father's wanderlust. He loved to travel. He positively loved the different cultures. He chose his career quite carefully, Susan thought. He had been in China now for almost 6 months. He enjoyed it very much. The last 2 months he had spent in a small place close to Guangzhou. They were 3 hours train ride from Hong Kong. Susan thought that she had absolutely no idea where he was, and she looked it up on the net. Guangzhou used to be called Canton. That sounded much more familiar to her ears. She read a little more about it. This sounded fascinating, and she was pleased that he had such a good time. He sounded quite excited about this Chinese girl he had met in Hong Kong. She had just finished her degree in acupuncture, and it seemed one of the reasons he went to, and she seemed to be one of the reasons that he went to Guangzhou, or Xinyan actually, a small place away from the main city, because her family lived there. Her name was Fayin Fa. He just called her Fay in his mails. He was obviously fascinated by her, or smitten is another word for it, she thought. Ben rarely got involved so immediately with a girl. He was lucky that he could follow her so easily. He was writing about his experiences to her and to friends. He had started a blog, a journal, which she had read on the internet. He also wrote directly to her, of course, but she liked to look at his general journal. She smiled because not only was he writing for a newspaper, he also wrote in his private time. He was a great communicator, she thought. She was so glad he was around when her marriage broke up. This sounded funny even to her ears, but that was how she'd felt. Ben was quite a wise little boy and grew up to become a really balanced young man. Despite the problems his parents had, he somehow managed to be good friends with both of them. She had wanted to leave the marriage. They had lots of talks and discussions how this would affect Ben. They always agreed that Ben should always be sure to be loved, and they would never forget that the other was just as close. They managed to separate relatively painlessly. Steve knew he'd had one too many little liaisons. He found it impossible to be true to her. His first affair was when Ben was only 6 months old. Anyhow, she wasn't going to rake over those old wounds. Whatever happened must have worked out okay overall, because she was certainly happy with her life now. Susan thought about the mail she got from him this morning. She had not yet tasted the feeling of the words she read. Ben had told her that Faye was pregnant. It had shocked her strangely. She wasn't quite sure why, but now she wanted to think about it. She had not told anyone yet. Holly had phoned her earlier today, and they even talked about Ben because Holly was also an avid reader of his journal. She knew about Faye. Ben kept mentioning her and the things she says. She did sound a lovely girl. She spoke perfect English, and she was very bright. And her parents had made sure she was educated. They originally came from Dali. This was an ancient city in the Yunnan province in the southwest of China. Anyhow, she was mentioned a lot in the last few months. How exactly Susan could not remember. She had not felt like telling Holly because she had to think how she herself felt about it. Holly was always quick to voice her thoughts. Somehow, Susan wished her mum was still around. Of course, she thought of her a lot, almost subconsciously sometimes, but at this moment, she imagined talking to her. China was so far away. He was still quite young, way off 30. It was so very different over there, and she found it hard to imagine his daily life. Anyway, she smiled. This might lead to me seeing China in a rather more intimate way, she thought. She even had problems imagining herself visiting this place. Well, these thoughts might be a little far too far ahead anyway. Best to simply accept the situation and see. She suddenly felt tired and wanted her bed. She cleared up quickly, switched off the lights, and went upstairs to bed. So this was chapter 35, explaining Susan, and the next chapter 34, and this chapter coming up is chapter 35, and it's entitled Holly, who is the daughter of Bliss, and that will be later, tomorrow, 23rd. Bye-bye. I hope you're good.